Come on, come on, come on, come on, now let's read, babe. John O'Keefe, present, accounted for, here. Oh my gosh. I apologize for not being able to be here with you yesterday. I was asked to be a part of other responsibilities, and that means I missed a day with you, and I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. John O'Keefe here, ready to get into this right now. I'm ready to get into this right here. Gregor the Overlander, hanging out with Vicus, hanging out with Luxa, hanging out with Henry. Isn't that funny that somebody has the name Henry in the middle of a place where people have names like Vicus and Luxa and Underlanders? Anyway, Gregor recently just took a bath. Boots got a clean diaper. They got to see like how the royalty of the Underland lived. They got this whole deal like, you don't want to be out there. There's a lot of bad news out there. You're going to be really in trouble if you try to sneak out. And Gregor's like, I'm going to try to sneak out. And good thing I got a backpack for Boots and all this, all that, right? So the reality is that's where we were at. We were right in the middle of reading about dinner time, and Gregor was looking at Vicus saying, so how did you guys get down here? So now we're hearing some background, right? This is going to be important. This is really important stuff as we get into the story, because now we are going to hopefully hear some of the information about how in the world a group of human beings decide to have their existence in the underworld, right? So this is how we go. Let's have fun. Gregor wondered how long it took people to become transparent with purple eyes. He turned to Vicus. So you were going to tell us how you got down here. And that's where I ditched out on you last. While Gregor tried not to wolf his food, which turned out to be absolutely delicious, Vicus filled him in on the history of regalia. Not all of it was clear, but it seemed the people had come from England in the late 1600s. Yes, they were led here by stonemason, one Bartholomew of Sandwich, said Vicus, and Gregor had to work to keep a straight face. He had visions of the future. He saw the Underland in a dream, and he set out to find it. Sandwich and a group of followers had sailed to New York, where he had gotten on famously with the local tribe. The Underland was no secret to the Native Americans. No surprise. Isn't it amazing how it's connecting to these kinds of things, how Native Americans the Navajo believe that they were led from the Underland to the Overland by a giant spider. Oh, you didn't know that? Yeah. The Navajo have a story about that. And actually the spider is their creator. So anyway, we got to get back to the story, but the fact is that it's funny how the Native Americans aren't totally overwhelmed and surprised by this. Bravo, Native Americans, for knowing that there are other worlds beyond us. Anyway, the Underland was no secret to the Native Americans, who had made periodic trips below the earth for ritual purposes for hundreds of years. They had little interest in living there and didn't care if Sandwich was mad enough to want to. Of course, he was quite sane, said Vicus. He knew that one day the earth would empty of life except what was sustained under and below the ground. Gregor thought it might be rude to tell Vicus that billions of people lived up there now. Instead, he asked, so everyone just packed up and moved down here? Heavens no. It was 50 years before the 800 were down and the gates to the Overland sealed. We had to know we could feed ourselves and have walls to keep us safe. Rome was not built in a day, Vicus laughed. This was how Fred Clark, the Overlander, said it. What happened to him? Asked Gregor, spearing a mushroom. Table got quiet. He died, said Solomon softly. He died without your son. Gregor lowered the mushroom to his plate. He looked over at Boots, who was covered from head to toe in some kind of mushy baby stew. She sleepily finger-painted on the stone tabletop with gravy. Our son, thought Gregor. Had it set? Was it bedtime? Had the police gone? Or were they still questioning his mom? If they'd gone, he knew where she'd be, sitting at the kitchen table alone in the dark, alone with grandmother. crying. Suddenly, he couldn't stand to hear another word about the Underland. He had to get out of it. Okay, so his story is that there was a group of people who had a vision to live under the ground. Took about 50 years to try to set up and prove whether or not it was going to work. And then they sealed themselves in the Underland. I wonder if I'd do that. I guess it's kind of the same idea as like, hey, would you go and live on Mars right now? Thanks, but I kind of like to take care of the earth that I live on right now, maybe clean it up a little bit, maybe help it heal. Just kind of stick around here. I kind of like the water. I kind of like the sun just at this temperature, kind of like my seasons, kind of like the trees, things that Mars don't have. Anyway, chapter 7. The darkness pressed down on Gregor's eyes until he felt it had physical weight, like water. He'd never been completely without light before. At home, street lights, car headlights, and the occasional flashing fire truck shone in the tiny room of his window. Here, once he'd blown out all the oil lamp, it was as if he'd lost the sense of sight entirely. Total darkness. Have you ever been there before? Have you? Have you ever been in that darkness before? I'm not just talking about like going into the mouth of a cave and turning the lights off. I'm not talking about going into your basement and covering the windows and turning the lights off. I'm talking about complete, utter, no matter what darkness. He'd been tempted to relight the lamp. Meredith had told him that torches burned all night long in the corridor outside his room, and he could rekindle the flame there. But he wanted to save the oil. He'd be lost without it once he got out of Regalia. That's right. He's going to try to run away, even though they've told him not a very good idea. Boots made a snuffling sound and pressed her back deeper into his side. His arm tightened around her. Servants had prepared separate beds for them, but Boots had climbed in right away with Gregor. It hadn't been hard to get to the Underlanders to excuse them for bed. It hadn't been hard to get the Underlanders to excuse them for bed. Man, sometimes I have to slow down and read. You ever have to do that? Everyone could see Boots could barely keep her eyes open, and he must have looked pretty tired and ragged himself. He wasn't. Adrenaline was pumping through him so fast. He was afraid that people could hear his heart pounding through the heavy curtains that shut off their bedroom from the hall. The last thing he could do was sleep. They had been invited to bathe again before bed. It was something of a necessity for Boots, who, in addition to stew, had conditioned her curls with some kind of pudding. Gregor hadn't objected either. The water gave him a quiet place to think out his escape plan. It also gave a chance to ask Dulcet about the water system in the palace without seeming suspicious. How do you guys have hot and cold running water? He asked. She told him the water was pumped from a series of hot and cold springs, and then it just empties back into a spring. Wait, and then it just empties back into a spring? He asked innocently. Oh, no, that would not be fresh, said Dulcet. The dirty water falls into the river beneath the palace and then flows to the waterway. It was just the information he needed. The river beneath the palace was on their way out. Even better, was their way out. It led to the waterway. Better yet, he didn't know what that was exactly, but Vicus had mentioned it had 2 gateways into the Overland. Boots stirred again in her sleep, and Gregor patted her side to quiet her. She had not seemed to miss home until bedtime, but she looked worried when he told her it was time to go to sleep. Mama? She asked. Lizzie? Was it only that morning that Lizzie had ridden off to camp on bus? It seemed like 1,000 years ago. By the way, that's a simile, but it's also a hyperbole. It seemed like 1,000 years ago. Simile, because we see the word seemed in there, but also 1,000 years, he has not been alive for 1,000 years. So that's a massive exaggeration. Home? Mama? Insisted Boots, even though she was exhausted. He had a hard time getting her to sleep. Now he could tell by how restless she was that she was having vivid dreams, probably full of giant cockroaches and bats, he thought. He had no way to tell how much time had passed. An hour? 2? But what little noise that he'd been able to hear through the curtain had ceased. If he was going to do this thing, he needed to get started now. Gregor gently disengaged himself from Boots and stood up. He fumbled in the dark and found the sling Dulcet had given him. Trying to position Boots inside it proved quite tricky. Finally, he just squeezed his eyes shut and let his other senses do the work. That seemed to be easier. He slid her in and slung the pack on his back. Boots murmured, "Mama?" And her head fell against his shoulder. "I'm working on it, baby," he whispered back, and searched the table for the lamp. That was all he was taking: Boots, the pack, and the lamp. He'd need his hands for other things. "Sorry. Long day." Gregor groped his way to the curtain and pushed the edge aside. There was enough torchlight from the far hall for him to make out the passage was empty. The Underlanders had not bothered to post guards at his door now that they knew him better. They were making an effort to make him feel like a guest, and anyway, where would he go? Down the river, he thought grimly, wherever that leads. He crept along the hall, taking care to place each of his bare feet silently. Thankfully, Boots slept on. His plan would disintegrate if she woke before he got out of the palace. Their bedroom was conveniently close to the bathroom, and Gregor followed his way to the watery sound. His plan was simple. The river ran under the palace. If he could make his way to the ground floor without losing the sound of water, he should find the place it drained into the river. If the plan was simple, its execution was not. It took Gregor several hours to weave his way down through the palace. The bathrooms were not always near the stairs, and he found himself having to backtrack so he wouldn't lose the sound of rushing water. Twice, he had to duck into his rooms and hide when he spotted Underlanders. There weren't many about, but some sort of guards patrolled the palace at night. Finally, the sound of water became stronger, and he made his way to the lowest level of the building. He followed his ears to where the roar was loudest and sneaked through a doorway. For a moment, Gregor almost abandoned his plan. When Dulcet had said, "river," he had pictured the river that flowed through New York. But this Underland River looked like something out of an action-adventure movie. It wasn't terribly wide, but it ran with such speed that the surface was churned into white foam. He couldn't guess its depth, but it had enough power to carry large boulders by as if they were empty soda cans. No wonder the Underlanders didn't bother to post a guard on the dock. The river was more dangerous than any army they could assemble. But you must be able to travel on it. They have boats, thought Gregor, noticing half a dozen crafts tied up above the rush of the current. They were made out of some kind of skin stretched over a frame. They reminded him of canoes at camp. Camp. Why couldn't he just be at camp like normal kid? Trying not to think of the bobbing boulders, he lit his oil lamp from a torch by the dock. On reflection, he took the torch as well. Where he was going, light would be as important as air. He blew out the oil lamp to save fuel. He carefully climbed into one of the boats and checked it out. The torch slid into a holder clearly designed for such. How do you get this thing down in the water? He wondered. Two ropes held it above. They were attached to a metal wheel that was affixed to the dock. Well, here goes nothing, Gregor said and gave the wheel a yank. It gave a loud creak and the boat fell straight into the river, knocking Gregor on his rear end. The current swept up the boat like it was a dried leaf. Gregor gasped the sides and hung on as they shot into the darkness. Hearing voices, he managed to look back at the dock for a moment. Two Underlanders were screaming something after him. The river curved and they vanished from sight. Would they come after him? Of course they would come after him, but he had had a head start. How far was it into the waterway? What was the waterway? And once he got there, where did he go next? Gregor would have been more concerned about these questions if he wasn't trying so hard to stay alive. Along with the boulders, he had to dodge the jagged black rocks that jutted out of the water. He found an oar lying along the bottom of the boat and used it to deflect the canoe off the rocks. The temperature of the Underland had felt comfortably cool since he'd arrived, especially after 90-degree heat of his summer apartment. But the cold wind whipping up off the water made goosebumps rise on his flesh. Gregor, he thought he'd heard someone call his name. Was it his imagination? Or no? There it was again. The Underlanders must be closing in on him. A river swerved, and suddenly he could see a little better. A long cavern lined with crystals shimmering around him, reflecting back in his torchlight. Gregor made out a glittering beach flanking one side of the river up ahead. A tunnel led from the beach into the dark. On impulse, Gregor pushed off a rock and pointed the canoe toward the beach. He paddled desperately with the oar for the shore. Staying on the river was no use. The Underlanders were breathing down his neck. Maybe he had time to pull up on the beach and hide in a tunnel. After they'd passed by, he couldn't wait. He could wait a few hours and then try the river again. The canoe slammed into the beach. Gregor caught himself just before his face hit the boat bottom. Boots, jerked partly awake, cried a little bit, and then he soothed her back to sleep with his voice as he struggled to pull his craft across the sand with one hand while carrying the torch with the other. It's okay, Boots. Go back to sleep. Go back to sleep. Hi, Bat, she murmured, and her head plopped back onto his shoulder. Gregor heard his name in the distance and sped up. He had just reached the mouth of the tunnel when he ran headfirst into something warm and furry. Startled, he staggered back a few paces, dropping the torch. Gregor's knees turned to jelly, and he sunk slowly into the sand. The face of a monstrous rat broke into a smile. And that's where I have to leave you today. What? I'm leaving you at Boris. Yeah, I have to leave. I gotta get ready for a job. There's a rat. You know, before we go, I have to make a real quick connection. Real quick. You remember Tale of Despero? Do you remember Chiaroscuro? Do you remember the rat of light and dark? The one that was so intelligent, the one that was kind of in the upper world while Despero was in the underworld of the deep down cellar. You remember that? And the rat was there just smiling. Kind of a very intelligent, but dark and kind of mischievous, dangerous character. We've heard a little bit about rats, haven't we? We've heard a little bit about how dangerous they may be. Now, Gregor and his sweet little sister Boots in a backpack are on a glittery beach, looking in the smiling face of a rat who is giant. Remember, ran soft and furry into it. Come back tomorrow. Tomorrow, we meet the rats. Ladies and gentlemen, I need to say I love you and get out of here early today, but that doesn't mean we didn't do some reading today. Thank you so much for being here. I can't wait to be there with you again tomorrow. Until we meet again, be safe, be wonderful. Today is the only day that you have. I hope you make it the best possible today that you can. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good day. Goodbye.